It was a stormy Friday night, the kind where the rain pounds relentlessly on the windows and thunder shakes the walls. I was enjoying a quiet evening alone, curled up on the couch with a good book. The sound of the rain was soothing, a comforting background noise that made me feel safe and cozy inside my warm home. As the clock neared midnight, a sudden, loud knock on the front door shattered the tranquility. I jumped, my heart racing. Who could possibly be out on a night like this? I hesitated, then approached the door cautiously. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness and rain. "Hello," I called out, my voice wavering. There was no response, just the relentless downpour. I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, peering out into the night. A figure stood on the porch, drenched and shivering. It was my neighbor, Mr. Thompson, from 3 houses down. "Mr. Thompson? What are you doing out here?" I asked, opening the door wider. He looked at me with wide, desperate eyes. "Please let me in. Someone's after me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. My instincts screamed at me to be cautious, but he looked genuinely terrified. I stepped aside to let him in. He stumbled into the hallway, water pooling at his feet. "What's going on?" I asked, closing the door and locking it behind him. He turned to me, eyes wide with fear. "They're coming for me. They won't stop until they get what they want," he said, clutching my arm. His grip was cold and clammy, sending a shiver down my spine. "Who's coming for you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Before he could answer, a loud bang echoed through the house, coming from the back door. We both froze. "They found me," he whispered, his face draining of color. I grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the kitchen, where the back door was located. As we entered, I saw the door swinging open, rain pouring in. A tall figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the storm. I could just make out a hooded figure, face obscured by shadows. "Get out of my house," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The figure stepped inside, and I caught a glimpse of a cruel smile beneath the hood. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," a low, menacing voice said. Mr. Thompson backed away, his terror palpable. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen counter, holding it out in front of me. "Leave now, or I'll call the police," I threatened. The intruder laughed, a cold, mocking sound that sent chills down my spine. With a sudden movement, the intruder lunged at me. I swung the knife, but he was too quick, knocking it from my hand. I stumbled back, crashing into Mr. Thompson. We both fell to the floor, the intruder looming over us. "You can't escape," he said, reaching down to grab Mr. Thompson. In a desperate move, I kicked out, my foot connecting with the intruder's knee. He grunted in pain, giving us a moment to scramble to our feet. "Run!" I shouted to Mr. Thompson, grabbing his arm and pulling him towards the front door. We burst outside into the storm, the rain immediately drenching us. Behind us, the intruder followed, his footsteps heavy and relentless. We ran down the street, the storm swallowing our desperate cries for help. Lights flicked on in neighboring houses, but no one came to our aid. We reached Mr. Thompson's house, and he fumbled with his keys, hands shaking. "Hurry," I urged, glancing over my shoulder. The intruder was getting closer, his figure a dark shadow against the rain. Finally, Mr. Thompson managed to unlock the door, and we tumbled inside, slamming it shut behind us. We locked the door and collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath. The intruder pounded on the door, but it held. Eventually, the pounding stopped, and we were left in silence, the storm raging outside. "I'm sorry," Mr. Thompson said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to drag you into this." I shook my head, too exhausted to respond. All I knew was that we had survived, and that was enough for now.
Relentless, pounding against the windows and roof with a fury that seemed almost personal. I had settled into my usual evening routine, sipping on a cup of tea while catching up on some work. The storm outside was the perfect backdrop for a cozy night in, or so I thought. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I heard a noise that made me pause, a distinct, deliberate knock on my front door. Given the weather, I found it odd that someone would be out at this hour, let alone knocking on doors. Curiosity piqued, I made my way to the door, peering through the peephole. There was no one there. I opened the door cautiously, peering out into the darkness. The rain was pouring down, making it difficult to see anything beyond the small porch light. I stepped out, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" No response. I chalked it up to a prank or perhaps a trick of the wind and returned inside, locking the door behind me. But as I settled back into my chair, the knock came again, louder this time. My heart raced as I approached the door once more, this time with more urgency. Again, no one was there. I felt a chill creep down my spine. Something wasn't right. Determined to find the source of the disturbance, I grabbed an umbrella and ventured outside. The rain soaked through my clothes in seconds, but I was driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. I scanned the street, looking for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road, illuminated by the faint glow of a street lamp. The figure was tall and indistinct, wearing what seemed to be a long, dark coat. I couldn't make out any facial features, but I could feel its gaze on me. I called out again, "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, but slowly turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. Feeling unnerved, I hurried back inside, locking the door and bolting it for good measure. I tried to shake off the encounter, convincing myself it was just some odd neighbor playing tricks. But deep down, I knew it was something more. That night, sleep didn't come easy. I kept hearing the knock, over and over, in my dreams. Each time, I would rush to the door, only to find the same empty space. When morning finally came, I felt exhausted and on edge. I decided to ask my neighbors if they had seen or heard anything strange the previous night. To my surprise, one of my elderly neighbors, Mrs. Harris, mentioned something that sent a shiver down my spine. "Oh dear, that must have been old Mr. Thompson's ghost. Poor soul, he used to live in your house before you moved in. They say he still wanders around on stormy nights, looking for something or someone." I laughed it off, trying to hide my unease. Ghost stories were common in old neighborhoods like ours, but I couldn't shake the feeling that what I experienced was more than just a tale. That night, the knocking returned, more insistent than ever. And this time, I knew better than to open the door. Instead, I stayed put, listening as the knocking grew louder and more frantic. I whispered a prayer, hoping it would stop. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking ceased, and the house fell silent. From that night on, every time it rained, I would brace myself for the knocking. And every time, I would remind myself of Mrs. Harris's story, hoping that whatever restless spirit haunted
had settled in for the evening, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls due to a power outage. As the clock struck midnight, I heard a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. I shrugged it off as the wind, but the whisper came again, more insistent this time. "Help me," it said. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and cautiously opened my front door. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the wind howled like a banshee. I stepped outside, my shoes immediately soaked, and followed the sound of the whisper. It seemed to be coming from my neighbor, Mrs. Thompson's, house. Mrs. Thompson had passed away 6 months ago, and her house had been vacant ever since. The windows were dark, and the place had an abandoned, haunted look about it. As I approached the front door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, just the sound of the rain and the occasional creak of the old house. I stepped inside, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The house was exactly as Mrs. Thompson had left it, her old furniture covered in dust. I made my way through the living room and into the hallway, where I heard the whisper again. "Help me." It seemed to be coming from upstairs. I climbed the creaky staircase, my flashlight flickering ominously. At the top of the stairs, I saw a figure standing in the hallway. It was a woman, her hair wet and matted, her eyes hollow and sunken. "Mrs. Thompson?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She turned to look at me, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I took a step closer, and she vanished into thin air. I stood there, stunned and terrified. My flashlight flickered again, and I heard the whisper once more, this time right behind me. "Help me." I turned around, and there she was, standing inches away from me. Her hand reached out, cold and translucent. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Help me," she repeated. "Find the letter." "The letter? What letter?" I had no idea what she was talking about, but I nodded. "Where is it?" I asked. She pointed towards her old bedroom. I swallowed hard and walked towards the door. It creaked open, revealing a room that had been untouched for months. I searched through the drawers and closets, but found nothing. "Help me," the whisper came again, more urgent this time. I turned towards the bed and noticed a loose floorboard. I pried it open and found an old, yellowed envelope. I opened it and read the letter inside. It was a confession, written by Mrs. Thompson. She had been involved in a hit-and-run accident years ago and had never come forward. The guilt had haunted her until her dying day. She had written the letter as a way to confess and find peace. I took the letter to the police the next day, and they opened an investigation. That night, as I lay in bed, I felt a sense of relief, as if a weight had been lifted. The rain had stopped, and the house was silent. I never heard the whisper again, but I knew that Mrs. Thompson had finally found peace. The ghostly encounter had left me shaken, but I was glad